Appreciate everybody joining us tonight who are here, everyone who is here. We're following up with a couple of previous presentations on classes in VBA. Kent has prepared a presentation to demonstrate how he uses classes. It leverages some of the things we've seen in previous meetings here or in other chapters, and I'm looking forward to where we go from here. So Kent, I will mute myself and take it away. Thanks.
G'day viewers. Today we're going to be building on some of the stuff that John Colby first introduced us to and introduced to me to in about 10 years ago. And I think last year we had Eric Blomquist presented some stuff that was kind of similar as well. Eric's one's worth going back to just to look at all the nifty stuff that Access does with lookup columns and things like that, which we won't be covering today, but we'll be looking at how to implement classes for our forms. So I guess the first question is, why the hell would we want to? Well, one of the things is it makes it really easy to make your forms consistent. And when I first build an application for a new client, I usually build a couple of forms as prototypes and get them to agree that, yes, this is what they want and how they want it to work. And then I clone those forms for the various other entities and transactions. So I usually begin by creating a mom table and a pop table, and then create the various relationships between the two parents and children and what have you. And then I create the forms and then start cloning them. But of course, clients can then change their mind. Oh, I want it to work a little bit differently. And if you've subclassed all your forms, then it's really easy to change it in one place and see all the changes affect all of the forms in your application. So that makes it really much easier to maintain your application and reduces the amount of development time. Now, with the form subclassing, the first thing we're going to be looking at is raising events in the subclass and having the events handled in the subclass rather than actually handling them in the event of the form itself. So we'll have a really simple look at that.
Kent, sorry to interrupt, mate. Are you showing anything on your screen? Because it sounds like you sort of are, but we all we see is the Reusable class demo for form and control classes.
And you're not seeing all of this text here?
Oh yeah, we're seeing that. Is that what you're? Sorry, I thought you might have been showing things in Access and we weren't seeing it.
No.
Please, sorry for the interruption. Please carry on.
That's all right.
Well, as long as Adrian interrupted, I will also. I just put a question in the chat, Kent. What do you mean by subclass and subclass?
Okay, well, I'll get back to that once I give you a really simple demo, and then I'll explain why we call them subclasses. The first example we're going to look at is just those basic form events, and then the buttons that do things like undo and save. So let's go and have a look at our customer form. We go into our customer form, and we've got just two controls here, and up in the right-hand corner, we've got a new button, an undo button, a save button, and a close button. So what happens when we actually edit a record, and that makes the form dirty, which enables our undo and our save, and you'll notice that the label under the close button now says save and close, because a lot of users don't understand that if they close the form, it's actually going to save the record, and that's normal Access behavior. So now if I click the undo, that's all back to where it was. Now, let's have a look at how we implement this. Now, as a very simple implementation, all we're doing is declaring an instance of the subclass, and then we're initializing the subclass. And as you can see, there's no other code required behind the form to enable or disable our buttons or do the undo or the save. Now, so why do we call it a subclass? Well, because the form itself is a class. So the form is a class of its own, and it's declaring this subclass form, subclass, that will do all the heavy lifting for it. That's why I term it a subclass. And we'll also subclass our controls as well. And the way it works is that, as we saw here, we're declaring an instance of the form of the subclass in the form itself, and we're instantiating the form. Now, when we go into the form subclass, it will then instantiate a subclass for each control. And let's have a look at what goes on with that process. Now, the form I have here has got a bit more complexity to it. But as you can see, we're still declaring the class, but without the new keyboard up here. And here we're actually instantiating the subclass explicitly using the new keyboard, the new keyword, and then we're calling the init method. So let's put a breakpoint there and see what happens when we open our form. Right. So we come to this subclass instantiation, which creates an instance of the collection that's going to hold all of the controls. Now we call the init method of the subclass, where we save a pointer back to the original form. And we've declared up here an instance of this subclass form as a form, but using the with events keyword. So let's just breeze over this bit here, because that's where we would normally go and look about permissions to see if the user has permission to open this form and whether they can edit and that sort of stuff. Firstly, we're going to grab a few little important things, like whether or not it's opened as a subform, in which case we would have a parent form. And that if we were to just say, okay, what's the parent name? It'll throw an error if there is no parent. And if it's not a subform, then we set the caption to be the same as the label title caption for reasons which I'll explain later on. We get a couple of other things. Then we see if the form allows additions and deletions so that we can either hide or show our delete and new buttons. And then we find out if it's a continuous form, which this one isn't. And for the continuous form, we'll have a look a bit later as how we do, for example, the background colors for the current record. Now, you'll notice there that for continuous, we've looked at the default view of the form, whereas if we're seeing if it's a datasheet form, we're looking at the current view, because even if you've created a form that is continuous or single view, you can still open it as a datasheet. But of course, with a datasheet, you aren't going to be able to see the buttons and things like that. So if it's a datasheet, open in datasheet view, we don't care about that. But now down here, we're going to raise the events that we're interested in. The onDirty event that's going to make the buttons enabled, the undo event that's then going to undo the record and disable the buttons, and the after update, which is going to fire after we've saved the record, and it will disable the buttons. We've got the current event that will be particularly interesting for continuous forms, and the before update event, which we will see what it does in a minute. Now, if we allow additions, we need a before insert. And here is where we would load the controls, but we're not going to do it this time around. We'll look at that in a minute. So now we've opened our form, and in our class that I can't quite get at because I've hidden that up there, if we have a look at our dirty event, oh, if only I hadn't hidden MZ controls, I'd be able to find things really easily. Let's just go to the, it's got to be here somewhere. Where have I put it? Oh, here we go. Our dirty event. And our close event, our undo event, and our after update. But we're actually going to be interested in the before update. So now when we change the record, we've hit the dirty event, which then goes through and enables those buttons. And you'll notice a couple of things here, like whether we allow additions and what have you. And these are the sort of things that the behavior might want to actually tweak when you actually get your application out into play and the users wanted to do it a slightly different way. And you've only got to make that one change here and away we go. Now, when we hit our undo button, we're going to hit the undo event of the subclass form subclass, where we're going to disable the buttons, and away we go. So here, this time, we've hit that dirty event. Our buttons are enabled. We hit save. We come to the before update event, where you'll see in the top right corner of the screen, with the last edit date, will now change. And then we go to the after update event, which will disable the buttons again. And off we go. Any questions at this point?
We do have one. Crystal is still looking for good definition of the terminology. Crystal, did my reply to your earlier question clarify that, or do you still need further clarification?
Yes, I didn't see that until I typed in my second question, and I'm still, still looking for, that was good. Thank you, Adrian. But
yeah, so the form is actually a class, and hence to differentiate the form from the form class that's being called by the form, I refer to it as the subclass, form subclass, as opposed to the form class proper. Does that kind of...
Okay, because you're calling stuff in a class module, or in a class, I guess it's a class module, but but maybe not. I mean, you don't necessarily have to subscribe to everything in there, right?
Well, it has to be a class module because you want to create a separate instance for each form in your application that as it opens. If it was in a standard module, you'd have all the forms trying to trip over themselves using the same code. Whereas with a class, you're instantiating a separate instance for this form, rather than being a standard module where any method in that standard module is being called by any form that happens to be open at the time. All right. So the next step of the exercise is that we want to look at how these buttons actually work. So let's have a look at our form instantiation this time. So we close the form, reopen it, and we're now instantiating. We've instantiated a new instance of the subclass. And we're now collecting the information about the form itself. We do any controls, and you'll notice here we've got a couple of things like the version number and what have you, the sort of things that you'd have on every form in your application. So they're all common functionality that we can put in this class. And then we come down to the events that we're raising. And as John showed you in his presentation, if you actually looked at the form in design view now, those event properties would have this in them. Right, so now we get to the controls. And what we're going to do is for each control, we're going to create an instance of the control class and then add it to the collection that we created when we first instantiated this form class. So let's have a look at our buttons. All right, so we've got a button. And the name of the button is command print, which not really using. Okay, so command close. We're creating an instance of the command button class. We're calling the init method of the command button, which needs to know the name of the form and the name of the parent form, because later on when we're trying to do a close, when we click on the close button, we need to know whether we're in a parent form or a subform, because if we're in a subform, we want to actually call the close of the parent form. We'll look to see if we've got allow additions and allow deletions so that we know if we can use those. We have a look to see if somebody's already put an equals in something in the event property for that button. And if they haven't, then we're going to set that to our event procedure. Now, in some instances, you can actually put an equals public function name, open bracket, closed bracket. And you don't want to overwrite that with this. However, if you've already used code behind your form for that event, this will do nothing because it already has that. And what will happen is that both the code in this subclass and the code behind the form will run. And we'll have a little look at that later on. All right, so now, having instantiated all of the controls on the form, we'll go back to the command button, where if I was clever, I put a breakpoint there, and I did. And I'll put a couple of breakpoints here. And we'll press F5 and run all the code. Take that breakpoint off. And there we go. So now, if we make a change, we've enabled our buttons. And if we click on the undo, it will take us to the code in the command button class. Now, we could use macros in that button. We could also use ribbon buttons and what have you. But the beauty of doing it in the class is that if we want to change the behavior, it's really easy to do it in the one place that affects all our forms. So for example, if the client decided that, okay, we don't want to put the focus back onto the previous control when we click on undo, we want to put it on the save button. And you've only got the one place that you need to do that. So there's quite considerable advantages to using a class to do this. Now, again, we make the change, we click on the save button, it takes us back to that control button class where we set focus back to our previous control and we save the record. And we've now hit the before update and then through the after update, and we're back there again. So we've seen how the save works. Now, as I mentioned before, the close event needs to know whether it's a parent form or a subform, and we're actually going to close the parent. If we allow new, then the new button will do something, otherwise we won't. Okay, so everyone's got the hang of how the buttons work. All right. So let's get a little bit more complex and have a look at what's going on with text boxes and combo boxes. Now, you'll see there where when I move the focus from one box to the other, one control to the other, the background color changes. Now, you could do that with conditional formatting and using the on focus. But the problem with that is that if you decide to change the color of the background, then you've got to go through and change every format condition in the application, which is a pain in the ass. So let's have a look at what happens when we instantiate our controls again. And we'll do a really simple one, which is the combo box. And then we'll have a look at a more complex one, which will be the text box. So with the combo box, again, we instantiate an instance of the combo box class. We call the init method of that combo box class. Here, does everybody know what I'm doing here with the list count? Well, you know how with the combo box, when you first open a form and you go to the combo box and you try to go to the bottom and it doesn't, and then it refreshes, this takes you, completely fills the combo box. So you don't have that issue of having to click on the page down to get to the bottom. Right, so we're going to collect the original back color and the fore color, and then raise the events for the got focus and lost focus, the key down and the change, which, and here we're getting the label. Now, I'm guessing that you probably already know that a combo box or a text box can only have one item in its controls collection, and that would be the label. But it doesn't necessarily have a label, in which case it's going to throw an error. So we're handling that. If the error equals 0, then there is a label and we want to get its details. Right, so that's what happens with the combo box, which is pretty simple. With the text box, it gets a little bit more sporty.
I don't know how to raise my hand, but I just wanted to mention that in controls such as a checkbox or a radio button, there is no back color, and I actually use the label, change the label's back color instead of like the text box's back color.
Yeah,
if you know what
that's
I'm saying.
generally what I do as well. But you'll see here that I've actually not bothered about that for this demonstration. But yes, that's something you can do there, and you'll see in the checkbox class, if you have a look at it, that's what I would be doing. All right, so here we've got no background, and we have this business here that looks to see, in my forms, I have the primary key in a text box, which is generally hidden. But when I go into dev mode, I actually want to see what that text box is. We'll check that out a bit later. So if we come here, we go to instantiate something interesting. All right, so we've got the delivery instruction. This is actually in the subform that's currently hidden. But let's actually have a look at what goes on here. We get the name of the form, whether it's continuous. In this case, it will be, but it's not open in datasheet view. And we get the back colors. We get whether it's got a control source. And then we decide whether it's bound or not. So if it's got something in the control source, it may not be bound if it's actually equals something. So we're interested in whether it's actually bound to a control, into a field in the record source. Because if it isn't, then it may be used for filtering or navigation or what have you. So again, we've got our on focus and lost focus, our key down, which will be very interesting when we get to that a bit later on. And we have a look to see what its data type is, which will be interesting later on. So we'll just, for the moment, let's go. Let's have a look. All right, so we've had a look at the record set of the form, told it what our control source is, and then we've found out what the data type is. In this case, data type equals 12, which is what, boys and girls? It's a memo field.
Oh, you didn't even give us a chance to answer. I knew.
Oh, it was a rhetorical question, Crystal. I knew you knew all that. All knew that. And again, we get the label stuff. And away
And
we
I
go.
was busy Googling it.
We're all laughing too, Ken.
You're laughing with me, not at me?
Both.
Absolutely.
Yes, and 10 is short text and 12 is memo and 11 is something.
Enough, Crystal. Enough.
Anyhow, so the reason we're interested in doing that is because let's get a little bit more sporty here. Right, let's unhide some of this stuff. Okay, so now we've got a list box down the left-hand side. If we go back to the code behind the form, we'll see that the after update event of the list calls the find method in the form subclass. Right, so we're not having to put a whole lot of code behind each form to handle the list boxes. We have a look at what it does here. Comes in here, okay, we've got our record set clone. If it's an ID, if it's a long integer ID, we're doing that. If it's a string, which it could be, but usually not, we do that. We do all the usual, find the stuff, set the focus back to wherever we want. In this case, we're setting it back to the control over here. And jobs are good.
Question.
Can we
Right.
can we take a question?
Yeah.
Okay, Ben, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, well, the most recent question is, how do you know that list box was supposed to find things? Why would you default it in the class to make any list box just find something?
Well, one of the issues there is that you notice that in the form, we're setting the focus back to here. Now, we want the same behavior in all our forms to do the same thing. And you notice that what happens is it's setting the focus back over here rather than leaving it in the list box. Now,
So
if we want to change
that
that,
exist on any list box on any one of your forms is always going to be a find?
yeah.
Okay.
And that way, if we decide that we want to actually leave it in the list box rather than going to here, we can. But in the form itself, we actually have a property that's going to tell us control 0 name. So that's the name of the control that we want to put the focus to after we've hit the list box.
Okay. I just thought it was a bad assumption to assume that a list box would be a find list box. But if that's the intent of this class, then that's fine.
Yeah.
And by the way, the way that I handle that is I have a naming convention. So I use combo boxes for that, and I'll call it control CBO rec cell for record selector. And I would have one at the top of every form, control rec cell. So in my case statement, I would load a class that specifically does that for record selectors. So that's one way to handle it.
Yeah, and generally with my forms, I would actually have a text box above that list box that allows you to enter characters and filter the list box down. And that I would also handle in the class. Anyhow, so let's get to a couple of other things. Down the subform here, right, you can see here we've got the blue telling us that that's the current control. And over on the right here, or now you can see there's a green back color that's doing that. But before we get into that, let's do something a little bit more interesting. Let's add a field such as the mobile number and the birth date. And you notice there that all I've done is just plonk those on the form. And the focus works. If I start typing numbers into there, and I get to the maximum length of that field, it's now changed to red. Now, Daniel Pinio has a really neat little video on, he actually puts a label to the right and says you've used 10 out of 12. And as you key down, it tells you how many characters you've got to go, which is pretty neat. But here, right, so that's a way of telling the user that we've got the maximum number of characters. With the birth date, if I try and type an illegal character for a date, then it cancels the key down event.
I love the color change. If you were to make it like yellow as a warning, you're getting close, and then red, you're there.
Well, see, here's the thing. If you're using a subclass, you can do it, and it's going to apply to every form in your application without you having to go through and do each one individually. So
exactly.
Let's have a look at what's going on in this text box class when we're doing this stuff. So let's go to all right, we've got the got focus, where we can see that if we go to a field, we hit the got focus. And here, and this is something you can't do with your conditional formatting, is that I can have a different back color depending on whether the control is locked or not. So if you, well, wrong button. If you put the focus over in the last edit, it's gone yellow because it's locked. If I put it here, it's light blue because it's not locked. Now, let's look at the key down event. And if we type another character, we come into our key down event and we go, okay. Okay, so the length is 12. And our, oh, okay. So we're still less than that. So we'll take the lock off there, the breakpoint off there, and we'll bung it down to here. That's a technical term, bung. Right, so now we've hit our maximum length. And we want to do some funky stuff to make sure we're not pushing the backspace. Because if we were to push the backspace, we don't want that to go red. Right, now when we're in the birth date, if I were to hit the plus key, we know it's a date type. We add a day. And if we hit the minus key, we go back a day. In some applications, I write that so that it actually goes back a weekday. So if it's on a Monday, it'll go back to the previous Friday. And again, you're doing all this in a class, so you can change the way that the whole application works just in the one place. Now, the other thing with the date is that we've got this business here. So if I were to type Y, our key code has been set back to 0. So unless it's a legitimate key for a date field or a number field, it gets nullified. So those are the kinds of things you can do. And you can saw I do that. I just drop those two fields onto the form and that functionality is already there. You don't have to do any more coding. let's have a look at a continuous form. Now, this continuous form, you'll notice we've got the allow edit checkboxes. So some records allow edits, in which case the background's blue, or if it's not editable, not mutable is easier to say, the background's that straw color. Now, you'll also notice that the green background tells you where what record you're on. Let's go and have a look at that because that's interesting. Right, here is our background text box. Not there, there. Now, one of the problems you have with having a background text box is usually it has to be the same width as the entire form, which means that when you want to select other controls, you've got to then unselect that, and it's a pain in the butt. So here, we just have that control there, and it can be any width, and it can be anywhere in the detail section. We don't really care. Because when we do the text box, so when we go into here, right, and if it is the background text box, then we put it all the way to the left and make it the same width as the form and change the foreground color. And that's just, you know, another one of those nice little things you can do. So now if we hit dev mode, we close this form. No, I don't want to make changes. We go back to our customer form. We take off our breakpoints, which I forgot to do. And you can see here we've got the primary keys and current IDs and that sort of stuff, which you might want to see when you're in development, but you don't want users to see them. So we can go and turn off our dev mode. And they're now hidden again. And again, that's all done in the instantiation of the text box with that code there. If I've got dev in the tag, then we want to hide it if we're in production, but we might want to show it when we're in developing. So those are kind of the sort of things you can do, but it's really only limited by imagination. We've got the ability to do things like, for example, with our subforms, and I like to late bind my subforms. This business of having the subform open before the parent form is annoying to say the least.
Annoying to say the least.
With my naming conventions, I generally use prefixes for controls. But for subforms, I make the subform the same name as its control source, as its object source. And why do I do that? Well, the reason is that, oh, and the other thing that you noticed I did before was to set the parent form's caption to be the same as the title label. Now, if with this subform, and if we have a look at its properties, you see the name of the subcontrol is the same as the source object. So if I delete that source object, I can then late bind it in this process over here. But if I were to actually put a value in the caption for that form, we have a look at it. We've got this caption property. And one of the little issues there is if you put a caption that says, say, delivery instructions, and having done that, the next time I drop that onto another form as a subform, the name of the subform control will be that rather than the name of the actual form, which I find a little bit annoying, but that's what it does. So that's why I don't put the caption in the forms caption property, I set it by using this title label. Okay, so you're starting to see all the little things that you could do with this. And this is really only just scratching the surface as to what you can do. We got any questions or suggestions?
There are a few.
I just wanted to raise the point in one of it was more of a comment than a question. The CodeContextObject, application.CodeContextObject, can save you from having to do a separate call to initialize the object and pass me, because when you first initialize, you can use the initialize event, and you will actually, the class code can refer to application.CodeContextObject, and that will be the same as what was me. Just thought I'd bring that to your attention.
Well, yeah, that's another way of doing it. But also when you're passing that, you notice I've used me. You can actually use form rather than me. So yeah, there's many ways you can flower that particular feline. But
yeah, that's true. Just that when you're just using me and you're passing that as a parameter, you generally don't need to, because the code will be able to get that for you. Something I've learned.
Yeah, true. If it's not the subform. Oh, that subform, that would be no. So
you've already explained why it won't be useful in all cases, and I fully accept that. And it wasn't sort of necessarily done as a correction; it was just an extra point of information.
Yeah, and yeah, they've also got the issue of explicitity rather than
explicitity. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Right, another one was sorry, I'm going to go through quickly if I can. Crystal likes your idea of changing color, and George and I both talked about different. You be able to do that for dates, for instance, where you have expiry dates, or if it's been over and over. That's your illustration is a perfect. That's a perfect thing that you can do with that, and we all sort of like that. Or anyone that comments. That's pretty much it. Yes, I don't think. John?
I also wanted to point out that if I recall correctly, if you put a subform on a tab control, the parent of the subform becomes the tab control, not the parent form. So you gotta deal with that.
Oh, that's not with controls. The parent is still a lot of times not the page of the tab control. It's still actually the form. And that was the other thing I was going to show you. How we do.
Well, Kent, I think John might be right on that thing.
Well, he might be.
Yeah,
but
I do think the parent of a subform on a tab control is the tab control.
Yeah, but it's not the page.
No, it's the tab control itself, not the page that the form is on. But you just got to be careful about that, because if you just assume that the parent of the subform is the form that everything is contained in, it's going to bite you in the butt when you start using tab controls.
So can you do parent if the parent is a tab control?
Yes, of course. Well, what you would need to do is when you try and recover your parent, you have to look at, is it a control? Is it a control type tab? And if the parent is that, then you go up another level, because you're going to be loading a class for the tab control itself, and its parent will be the form unless it's on a tab. I mean,
and the change event
it can get ugly.
The trick actually is when you instantiate the wrapper, the subclass, whether you're using a property set procedure or, in a init procedure, it's a sub or a function, to include the parent object, to bind the parent object to the subclass, instead of having the subclass look up its parent. Which ends up being much more satisfactory. And it's also the case many times, I found, when it's important to bind not only the parent form, but also the top form separately, because especially when you start getting into refreshing, for example, combo boxes on subforms, the activate event does not fire for subforms, but it does for top forms. And so you need to be able to sync the top form events and perhaps also the parent form events if you're talking about a subform.
And that's why in the control
to
subclasses, I capture the parent form as well as the form.
Yeah,
Now,
that's often critical.
and the other thing to remember with tab controls, if you're putting subforms on tab controls and you want to relate bind, you can actually use the change event of the tab control to load the source object of the subform. But I haven't even tried to subclass my tab controls in this particular demo, but that's what you would need to do. But let's go back to have a look at this background control that I've got here. And what you'll notice is that I'm not using conditional formatting. And this is just another way to skin this particular cat, because there's about 50 others. But what I'm doing here is that when I load this form, if it's a continuous form, all right, I'm raising the key preview. Oh, sorry, setting the key preview to true. I'm raising a key down event, and I'm using this section class where I see if I've got a background text box, see if I've got a primary key and a current key.
Ken, sorry to pull you back, mate. Would you mind going back to that where you said you raise an event? And I don't think it was raising an event. You set the event property, but you didn't raise the event. You didn't fire it off.
No, but I created I stuck the event procedure in there so that I've got the event to work with.
You've set the event property, right? Okay, because that's a bit of a different.
Yeah, I think what Adrian's getting at is that there is also a raise event that isn't being run, but you're raising it because you've assigned it.
No, sorry.
You're allowing it to be raised. Yes.
It's a setting the property. A raise event is something completely different. Sorry, Ken, I don't mean to be, but it's not I said what I meant to say, and I think that's now clear. I think we should be happy on that. So,
well, yeah, and it's important to say what you mean to say. As Talking Heads once said, people who don't say what they mean don't mean what they say. So it is important to get your terminologies correct. Otherwise, when you're talking to somebody, you're talking two different languages. And yes, thanks for pulling me up on that one, Adrian. Well done. Okay, here.
And by the way, our classes will be raising events, some of them. I raise events in my classes all the time. So, yes.
All right, so here we're creating an instance of the section class and we're initializing that. So we've made sure we've got this background color and the primary key and the current and we're actually bung an event procedure in the on paint. And it's the on paint that's doing the background color. So that's just another way to do it.
And the on paint then makes it that specific line. That's
Yep.
why it's just one line. Oh, that's cool.
Well, so it's using, right, when these two are the same, right, when we had a look in here,
Are we able
if
to? Sorry.
that equals that, then we're going to make the background color this soft green. Otherwise, it's just going to be white.
How does that compare? Excuse me, Liam. How does that compare to conditional formatting in terms of performance?
Same. Oh. Well, to give you an idea, when have I got one in this application?
Ken, I think the easy answer to that is that neither of them have a performance hit which is worth worrying about. Sorry, George, they would be, you wouldn't see either in most cases, except very rare cases.
Yeah, and the paint event comes in really handy where you've got quite complex conditional formatting going on, and the paint event can be a lot easier way to maintain things. And as I've pointed out previously, I've been having problems with conditional formatting in 64-bit applications, particularly in combo boxes, I think, but it's been giving me grief. Anyhow, I just thought, yeah, this is just another way of doing it. It's not better, it's just different.
It's very, very cool. So the paint event basically fires once for each line.
Yep.
Each populated line. That is cool. Okay.
Yep. So that was just, an interesting thing to
Mikey
do. With
likes it.
continuous.
Okay. Excuse me. Gosh. I'm drinking.
All right, so we're getting close to time.
We're approaching our nominal time span, so.
But we've pretty much covered everything, and it's just a whole lot of, what could I do with this?
Does anybody have a suggestion of what you might?
And keep them polite, please.
I do.
Go ahead, John.
I use an active field and a trash field in every table. And the active is set true by default and the trash is set false by default. And then I put a bound active and trash checkbox in the top, well, in my case, and it was in the top left corner and it was hidden, but it's there. So now when the user hits delete, they say, I want to delete this record. My class intercepts the before delete and goes, no, we don't allow deletes. And it clears the active flag and sets the trash flag and requeries the form. And the form's
query
only displays active records. So they hit delete. It looks like they deleted the record, but all we really did was cleared the active flag and set the trash flag. Now a supervisor or a manager or me can say, well, for enough money, I can get that record back for you. And you go in and find the record and set the active back true and the trash to false. And voila, their deleted record is back again.
So
yeah, and I do the same in
record filters out trash.
I do the same in a lot of applications, and the number of times it saved my butt. Somebody said, your application's lost all these records. And you're going, well, you set this one to inactive at this particular time. And Jenny here set this one to inactive at this particular, and they go, oh, okay, sorry.
Now you went even further and recorded who the person was that actually did it. I didn't bother doing that.
Well, I get that in the last edit. So in the before update, right? We can set the last edit, and in some cases, I actually have a delete by. and delete date. So when somebody sets a record to inactive, it captures that separately to the edit. But of course, then you can start using audit tables and, do stuff like that. And in SQL Server, that's easy. But
All I was interested in was getting the money from them to undelete their records,
yeah, well,
Sorry to interrupt. I'm looking at the time and I'm noticing that we're going quite off topic at the moment. I suspect we'll be here for a while. So off topic discussions are perfectly fine. I just wondered if George might want to finish up, close off the recording, and then we could hang around, if that's what you're thinking, George.
Yes, thank you. You said it better than I could at this point. Yeah. Let's kind of wrap up the formal presentation. Kent, do you have any kind of summary that you'd like to?
okay. Well, so the summary is basically what we've got here, which is that we're declaring the pointers between the form itself and the form subclass, and they've each got a pointer to each other. And then we run the init method, which collects the information that we need about the form, whether it's got a parent, allows additions, deletions, and whatever. And then it creates an instance of each control, which it adds to the controls collection in the subclass. And it creates these events for us to use. I think that's pretty much the overview and the summary. But the major advantage of this, as you're starting to see, is that you can change the behavior throughout your entire application and keep it consistent and just tweak the way it works just in these classes rather than having to go through and do find and replace throughout your entire application.
Outstanding. All right, so I'm going to wrap this up quickly. Stop the recording.
Well, before you do, I think Kent did a wonderful job.
Yeah.
Thank you very, very much, Kent. You cleared up a lot of issues or questions, as well as those who, chatted.
Yeah.
I'd like to add my congratulations as well to Kent and say, yes, I think he did a wonderful job too.
Yeah.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, Crystal.
Yeah.
And thank
Anybody
you, George,
else?
for making all of this possible.
All right, so I'm going to stop the recording and we can kind of go on from there according to your.
Your voice is going, George.
Yeah, I haven't really talked that much. Here we go. I'm going to end the recording. I'll see you all next month. Thank you.